The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden podium 3 times before the crowd fell silent, and Adelaide Keller stood on the platform in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the blazing summer of 1882, with no one bidding for her at all. She had arrived 3 weeks earlier on the westbound stage from Missouri, answering an advertisement placed by a man named Cornelius Hatch, who had promised her a home, a name, and a new beginning far from the wreckage of her old life. The letter had been careful and courteous, and Adelaide, at 23 years old, with nothing but a carpetbag and a shattered inheritance behind her, had believed every word of it. She had traveled 600 miles through dust and scorching heat, through 2 broken axles and 1 river crossing that left her hem soaked to the knee, and she had arrived in Dusty Creek to find that Cornelius Hatch had buried himself 2 weeks prior after losing a card game to a man named Grady Potts, and then making the catastrophic mistake of accusing Grady Potts of cheating out loud. Adelaide had stood at the stagecoach depot, reading the notice pinned to the post outside the general store, while the driver unloaded her trunk, and she had felt the particular sensation of the ground dropping out from beneath her feet that she was coming to recognize as a pattern in her life. The town of Dusty Creek was governed, loosely, by a mayor named Aldous Combs, who had a habit of turning every problem into a civic event, and every civic event into a reason to charge admission. When he discovered that a mail-order bride had arrived with no groom to receive her, he saw not a tragedy but an opportunity, and within 3 days he had organized what he called a bride selection, which was a thing Adelaide would have had strong opinions about under any other circumstances. But she had exactly $4.11 to her name, and the temperature outside was 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and her other option was to take the next stage back to Missouri, where she had no home left and a stepbrother who had already sold the family property out from under her. So she stood on the platform in her blue dress with the white collar, her dark hair pinned back under the bonnet she had worn since Kansas City, and she listened to Aldous Combs describe her attributes to the gathered townspeople with the same detached politeness she might have used to listen to a recitation of scripture she did not quite believe. There were 11 men who had expressed interest before the event. By the morning of the auction, 3 had found reasons not to attend. By the time Adelaide took the platform, 4 more had drifted to the back of the crowd and then beyond it. The remaining 4 stood in a rough cluster near the podium, and Aldous Combs began the bidding at $15, which was the price he had calculated covered his administrative costs and left him something for his trouble. The 4 men studied Adelaide with the frank assessment of people at a livestock fair, and Adelaide studied the horizon past their heads with the careful calm of someone who had made her peace with humiliation as a temporary condition. The first bid came from Earl Briggs, who ran the feed store, and it was $15 exactly, offered in the flat tone of a man completing a transaction rather than beginning a life. Adelaide had met Earl Briggs when she came in to ask about temporary work, and she remembered that he had a habit of not quite meeting her eyes, and that his establishment smelled strongly of something she could not identify but did not like. The second bid, $16, came from a man she did not know, a drover named Amos, who looked roughly twice her age and kept wiping his palms on his trousers in a way that suggested nerves or heat or something she preferred not to consider too carefully. The third and fourth men declined to bid at all. Aldous Combs cajoled. He described Adelaide's cooking abilities, of which he knew nothing, and her strong constitution, which was at least partially true, and her pleasant appearance, which was objectively accurate, and which Adelaide found both the easiest and most humiliating thing he said about her. The crowd shuffled. A woman in the back called out something that might have been a price or might have been a comment, and people laughed, and Adelaide looked at the horizon very steadily and thought about what her mother had told her once, which was that dignity was not something other people could take from you, only something you could surrender yourself. She had not surrendered it yet. Then the bidding stopped entirely. Aldous Combs was in the middle of a sentence about what a fine helpmate a woman of Adelaide's character would make when someone at the back of the crowd said, clearly and without theatrics, $30. The crowd turned. Adelaide turned. Even Earl Briggs and Amos the drover turned, and the look on their faces was the same look of surprise that Adelaide suspected was on her own, though she had more practice at keeping things off her face. The man who had spoken was standing at the edge of the crowd, separate from it by a foot or two in every direction, in the way of a man who was accustomed to people making space for him without being asked. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a duster that had been black once, and was now a complicated shade of gray-brown that came from long use in a dusty climate. He had a hat pulled low over a face that was, Adelaide could see even from 40 feet away, marked on one side by a scar that began near his left ear and swept across his jaw in a pale ridge that caught the afternoon light. He was perhaps 28 or 30 years old, and he was standing with his thumbs in his belt in the loose, weight-balanced stance of a man who had learned a long time ago that trouble came from unexpected directions, and that it was better to be ready for all of them. He had dark eyes and a jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that is not stubbornness but something older and more considered. He was not, Adelaide thought, handsome in any conventional sense that the word usually implied, but there was something in the way he stood that made conventional seem like an impoverished category. Aldous Combs recovered from his surprise with the speed of a man who recognized money and said, $30 from Isaiah Warren. Do I have 35? Earl Briggs looked at the scar and apparently decided that $35 was not worth whatever conversation might follow that decision. Amos the drover had already taken a step backward. The crowd was very quiet in the way of people watching something they do not fully understand but recognize as significant. $30 once, Aldous Combs said. $30 twice. Adelaide looked directly at the man named Isaiah Warren, and he was looking directly at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not parse from this distance, something that was not the frank cattle market appraisal of the other men, not indifference, not calculation, but something quieter and more complicated, like a man looking at something he both wants and is uncertain he deserves. "Sold," said Aldous Combs and brought the gavel down. "To Isaiah Warren for $30. The crowd dissolved into conversation, and Adelaide stepped down from the platform with her head up and her spine straight, and she walked toward Isaiah Warren through the parting crowd, because there was nothing else to do, and she had decided a long time ago that walking toward things was preferable to standing still and letting them come to her sideways. She stopped 2 feet in front of him and looked up at him because he was considerably taller than she had estimated from the platform, and she said, without preamble, "You paid double what anyone else offered. I would like to know why." Isaiah Warren looked at her for a long moment. The scar on his jaw moved slightly when he shifted his weight. His dark eyes were very direct, and the expression in them was still that complicated thing she could not name, and he opened his mouth, and then something happened that she did not expect from a man who had walked through a crowd of 100 people and bid $30 on a stranger without apparent hesitation. He could not answer. Not that he was silent from coldness or calculation, but that he genuinely seemed to have arrived at a place where words were not available to him. His mouth closed. He looked at her for another moment and then looked briefly at the ground and then back at her, and finally he said, in a voice that was low and a little rough, the voice of a man who spent more time in open country than in company, "I am not entirely certain." Adelaide Keller considered this answer for what felt to both of them like a very long time, and then she said, "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I left Missouri." She picked up her carpet bag, which she had set at the foot of the platform, and she looked at him again with those clear gray eyes of hers and said, "I suppose you had better show me where we are going." Isaiah Warren's ranch was called the Double Bar W, and it sat 7 miles outside of Dusty Creek at the base of a limestone ridge that turned orange in the late afternoon light. He had a buckboard and 2 horses, and he drove well, managing the reins with a practiced economy of motion that suggested long familiarity with the task. Adelaide sat beside him on the bench and watched the landscape, which was enormous in the way that Missouri had not prepared her for. The sky seemed to begin at the ground and go straight up forever, and the light was the kind of hard, golden light that made everything look both beautiful and merciless. They were 2 miles out of town when she said, "I should tell you something about myself since we appear to be getting married." "You do not have to," he said. "I would prefer to," she said. "My father died 4 years ago, and my stepbrother sold our home in Columbia before the will was properly probated. I have a teaching certificate from the Missouri State Normal School that I earned in 1879, and I have worked as a school teacher and as a seamstress, and I can manage a household, and I intend to be useful to whatever circumstance I find myself in. I am not fragile, and I am not foolish, and I would appreciate if you would speak to me as though I am neither." Isaiah drove another quarter-mile before he said, "All right." She waited, and he did not add anything, and she realized that for him this was not a cold response but a complete one, that he had heard what she said and accepted it entirely and saw no need to ornament that acceptance with unnecessary words. She found to her surprise that she did not find this disagreeable. "Your turn," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves made a steady sound on the dry road. Out to the left, a pair of roadrunners crossed the scrub at a brisk pace, and Adelaide watched them go. "I have run the double-bar W for 6 years," he said. "My father built it and I inherited it when he passed, and I have added to it since. I have 3 cowhands who work the cattle drives and 1 older man, Pete Calhoun, who tends the stock year-round. The house is stone and wood, and it is kept reasonably clean considering that it has been lived in only by men." He paused. "I am not easy company, I know that, but I am not cruel company either." "How did you get the scar?" she asked. She asked it directly, the way she asked most things, because she had found that directness usually produced better results than the elaborate circling approach that people sometimes mistook for politeness. She watched to see if he would stiffen or deflect. "He did neither. He said, 'Fire,' when I was 19, a barn fire on my father's property. I went in after a horse that I was particularly fond of, and the roof came down on one side." He was quiet for a moment. "I got the horse out." Adelaide looked at him. "Good," she said, and meant it. He looked at her briefly from the corner of his eye, and she saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of surprise at finding someone who responded to that story in exactly that way. The double-bar W appeared first as a smudge of structures against the limestone ridge, and then resolved itself, as the buckboard made the final approach, into a solid and respectable property. The main house was built from limestone and cedar, with a covered porch running the full front width and a stone chimney at each end. There was a barn, painted red and showing its age honestly, and a bunkhouse and several smaller outbuildings, and a kitchen garden behind the house that had been started and then largely abandoned, with a few resilient squash plants surviving in the untended rows like small acts of botanical stubbornness. Pete Calhoun was on the porch when they arrived, a man of perhaps 60 with a white beard and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking at the Texas sky. He watched Adelaide climb down from the buckboard with an expression of careful neutrality that she recognized as the trained patience of a man who had learned not to comment on things that were not his business, which she respected. "Pete," Isaiah said, "this is Adelaide. She will be staying." "Ma'am," Pete said, and touched his hat with a courtliness that was genuine and unaffected. "Mr. Calhoun," Adelaide said, "I notice your kitchen garden is in some difficulty. I can do something about that if you have the seeds." Pete looked at the garden and then at her. "We got seeds," he said. "Couldn't never get the timing right." "I can get the timing right," she said. She followed Isaiah into the house, and he showed her the rooms with the economical efficiency of a man giving a tour of something he is slightly uncertain how to present. The main room was large and comfortable in a rough sort of way, with 2 good chairs by the fireplace and a long table and a kitchen that had been used for function and never for beauty. There were 2 bedrooms off the back hallway. "There are 2 rooms," he said, stopping in the hallway. I thought he stopped and began again. "I do not take anything for granted. The choice of how we arrange this is yours." Adelaide set her carpetbag down at the entrance to the hallway and looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that," she said. "I would like a little time." "Take whatever time you need," he said, and she believed him. She chose the room on the right, which had a window that looked east toward the limestone ridge, and she unpacked her carpetbag with the methodical care of a woman who had learned to take comfort in small, orderly actions. She had a Bible her mother had given her, and a small portrait of her parents done when she was a child, and a packet of letters she had tied with ribbon and did not plan to look at again, and the carpetbag itself, which she kept because it was the only thing she owned that had traveled as far as she had. She put these things in their places and smoothed the coverlet on the bed and stood at the east window watching the ridge turn colors in the late light, and she thought, not for the first time, about the particular nature of starting over. She had done it twice already. Once when her father died and the easy, comfortable shape of her life simply ceased to exist. Once when the schoolhouse in Clary County closed for lack of funding, and she had to go back to Columbia and sew buttons on other women's dresses for wages that barely covered her room at the boarding house. She was becoming experienced at starting over, which she supposed was a skill, though not one she had ever aspired to have. She heard Isaiah in the kitchen, moving carefully, making the sounds of a man who was trying not to make too much noise in his own house, because he was aware that someone else was now present in it. She thought about the way he had looked at her from the edge of the crowd before he bid, and she thought about the way he had said he was not entirely certain why, and she found that she believed him, and that this belief did not make her feel insecure. It made her feel, rather unexpectedly, like she was starting over in a situation that was genuinely unknown and therefore genuinely possible, which was different from the other times. They ate supper together that evening, a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork and beans that he had started before she arrived, sitting across from each other at the long table while the evening came in through the windows, and the lamplight made the kitchen warm and gold. He asked her if the food was all right, and she said it was, and she asked him how many head he was running this year, and he said 600, and she asked him how the water situation was on the range, and he said it had been a dry year but not catastrophic, and by the end of the meal they had covered, in plain practical language, about a dozen topics, and had arrived at something that was not quite comfort but was the honest beginning of it. After supper, he sat on the front porch in the warm evening air, and she came out after washing the dishes and sat in the second chair, and they watched the stars come out over the Texas plain in the particular thick abundance that only exists far from city light, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence, which she took as a good sign. He rode out the next morning before dawn to check the south pasture fence line, and she woke to an empty house and stood in the kitchen in her house dress feeling the particular quality of the silence. And then she made a decision and got to work. She found what was in the larder and what was not, and she made a list in the margin of a piece of brown paper with the stub of a pencil. And then she went to the kitchen garden with a hoe she found in the lean-to and spent 3 hours clearing the weeds from the neglected rows and working the soil into something that might, with attention, become productive. Pete Calhoun came by around 9 and watched her for a while from the garden gate, and then silently picked up a second hoe from the lean-to and came in to work beside her. And they got twice as much done in half the time, and talked pleasantly about squash varieties and the best method for keeping rabbits out of a garden. And by the time Isaiah came back at noon, the kitchen garden had been cleared and planted with the seeds she had found in the barn. And there was cornbread cooling on the kitchen table, and a pot of chicken stew on the fire from a rooster that Pete had identified as surplus to requirements. Isaiah stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the meal on the table and then at her, standing with her hair loose from its pins and her sleeves rolled up in a smear of garden soil on her left cheek. And he said quietly, "You did not have to do all this." "I know," she said. "Sit down. You must be hungry." He sat down and he ate, and she sat across from him and ate too, and she noticed that he kept looking at the kitchen with something on his face that took her a while to identify. It was the expression of a man who had not realized that a place could look different until it was shown to him. A look of something she might have called wonder if she had not been afraid that was too large a word for what was essentially clean countertops and a properly seasoned pot on the fire. But she kept the thought to herself and poured him more coffee and asked him about the fence line, and he told her about the section that needed new wire, and the conversation was easy and familiar in a way that surprised her. The preacher in Dusty Creek was a tall, thin man named Reverend Hollies, who wore his collar with the confident authority of a man who believed entirely in the moral weight of his position, which Adelaide thought was either admirable or exhausting, depending on the day. He came out to the Double Bar W on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Adelaide's arrival, because Aldous Combs had sent a note to Isaiah reminding him that the transaction of the auction required formal sanction from the church in order to be legally considered a marriage, a fact that Aldous had invented, but that neither Adelaide nor Isaiah felt sufficiently motivated to dispute. Reverend Hollies performed the ceremony on the porch of the Double Bar W with Pete Calhoun and a young cowhand named Thomas Reeves as witnesses. Thomas was 19 years old and had the open face of someone who had not yet learned to arrange his expression in social situations, and he watched the ceremony with such naked interest that Adelaide found it endearing rather than intrusive. Isaiah stood beside her in a clean white shirt and his least battered hat, and said the words in the same low, deliberate voice he used for everything, and Adelaide said them in her own clear voice, and Reverend Hollies pronounced them married and seemed satisfied with the result, and rode back to town before noon. Afterward, Pete Calhoun shook Isaiah's hand, and then, with a formality that was touching, shook Adelaide's hand as well, and Thomas stood nearby with the expression of someone who felt the occasion called for some kind of gesture, and was uncertain what it was. "I made a cake," Adelaide said, because she had been up since 5 doing exactly that, and it was sitting under a cloth in the kitchen, and a cake seemed like the right thing to have after a wedding, even a wedding like this one. They ate the cake in the kitchen and drank coffee, and Pete told a long story about a wedding he had attended in Abilene in 1871 that had devolved into a fistfight by sunset, and Thomas laughed so hard at the ending that he nearly fell off his chair, and Adelaide laughed too, and even Isaiah's face, which she was beginning to learn could be read in very small increments, showed something that was unambiguously enjoyment. Later that night, when the cowhands were in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet and the lamps were burning low, Adelaide sat at the kitchen table with her Bible and the small portrait of her parents which she had brought out to find a place for, and Isaiah came in from checking the horses and saw her sitting there and stopped in the doorway. "Your parents," he said, looking at the portrait. "Yes," she said. "They were married 31 years. My mother used to say it was the finest decision she ever made." She paused. She also used to say that knowing it was the finest decision took about 10 years to become clear, which she thought was a reasonable timeline. Isaiah looked at the portrait for another moment and then looked at her. "She sounds like a sensible woman." "She was extraordinary," Adelaide said simply. He sat down in the chair across from her, which was becoming, she realized, a pattern, and he looked at the table and then at her, and she could see him working towards something, turning a thought over the way you turn a stone over with your boot to see what is underneath it. "I want to explain about the auction," he said finally. She waited because she had learned in 3 days that he needed to be waited for, not pushed. "I have been thinking about it for a while," he said. "Getting married. Not because I am lonely exactly, though that is part of it. More because there is something wrong about the shape of this place. I built it and I run it and it is mine, but it does not feel like a life yet. It feels like a set of tasks. He stopped and looked at the table again and then back at her. I saw you standing on that platform, and the other men were looking at you like you were something to be acquired, and you were looking at the horizon like you were measuring the distance to something better, and I thought. He stopped again. Adelaide did not move. The lamp between them made the kitchen very warm and close. I thought that whoever you were, you deserved better than what was being offered, he said. So I bid higher than anyone else. And then I thought, if she is a reasonable person, maybe I can explain and maybe she will understand what I mean. He looked at her steadily. I do not entirely know what I mean. That is the truth. When you asked me on the platform, I could not answer because it was not finished becoming clear to me yet. Adelaide Keller looked at Isaiah Warren across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she thought about 10 years being a reasonable timeline for something to become clear. And she thought about the particular bravery of admitting that you acted on something before you understood it. And she said, I think I understand better than you might expect. She told him then, in the quiet of the kitchen, with the night air coming in through the window screen, about the letter from Cornelius Hatch and the stage ride from Missouri, and arriving to find a death notice where a life was supposed to be, and the $4.11 and the platform, and the way she had looked at the horizon, because she was working very hard not to look at the men who were looking at her like something that could be assessed by visual inspection. She told him about her mother and the 31 years, and her father and the will, and the stepbrother whose name she said only once and then did not say again. She told him about the schoolhouse in Clary County and the teaching certificate she was still proud of even when it was not doing her any practical good, and she told him that she had spent the 3 days since arriving trying to determine if he was a good man and that she had decided that he was. He was quiet for a while after she finished. Then he said, What made you decide? The horse, she said. He looked briefly uncertain and then he said, The horse I went into the barn for. You went into a burning barn for a horse, she said, and you got it out. A cruel man does not do that. A good man does. He was quiet again, and she saw something move across his face, something she was beginning to recognize as the specific expression he made when something mattered to him more than he had been prepared for it to. You can stay in your room as long as you like, he said. I meant what I said about that. I know you did, she said. Go to sleep, Isaiah. You have a fence to fix tomorrow. The corner of his mouth moved. It was very nearly a smile. She filed it away carefully, the way you press a wildflower between pages for the sheer fact of its rarity and beauty. The weeks that followed had the quality of a season genuinely changing, slow and inevitable and full of small noticed things. Adelaide planted the kitchen garden with systematic determination, and got the squash and the beans and the tomatoes establishing themselves in the dry Texas soil with a combination of careful watering and the particular fierce competence she brought to everything she undertook. She organized the kitchen, which had previously been arranged according to no discernible principle, so that things were where it made sense for them to be, and she repaired the curtains in the main room, which were original to the house's construction, and had been slowly losing their struggle with the sunlight for several years, by taking them down and dyeing them a deeper blue that would hold longer. She wrote 3 letters to the Dusty Creek School Board explaining that she had a teaching certificate and an interest in the open position at the schoolhouse, which had been taught by a series of inadequate substitute teachers since the last regular teacher had left the previous spring. She also, with more deliberateness than she allowed to show, paid attention to Isaiah. She had spent 2 years of her life, between her father's death and coming west, in the company of people who spoke primarily to fill space, who used words as a kind of social filler that occupied the surface of every room and prevented anything underneath from being clearly seen. Isaiah was the opposite of this in every conceivable way. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say and he had thought about it, and he wanted it to be accurate. She found, after the first week, that she was listening to him with the focused attention she usually reserved for things that she considered important, and that this was not an effort but a natural consequence of talking to someone who made every word count. He had a dry humor that emerged infrequently and without announcement, usually at moments when she was not expecting it, and she found she liked it disproportionately, the way you like a flower that blooms only once a season. He had opinions about everything from fence post materials to the Mexican cattle industry to the proper way to read weather in a Texas sky, and all of his opinions were grounded in actual experience and careful observation, and he stated them without the defensive posturing of a man who needs to be right, which she found refreshing in the extreme. He was, she concluded by the end of the second week, a genuinely interesting person. She had not expected that. She had expected to make the best of what she had, which was a different and more melancholy project. One evening in the third week she was on the porch after supper, mending a tear in one of his working shirts, when he came and sat in his chair and looked out at the ridge in the last light and said, unprompted, "My mother left when I was 11. Adelaide kept her needle moving because she sensed that stopping would make it harder for him to continue. She went back to her family in Virginia," he said. "She found this country too hard. I do not blame her for it." He paused. "My father never talked about it. He just worked harder and I worked beside him, and the place is what it is because of both of us, and I do not know which parts are his and which are mine anymore." "That is not a bad kind of not knowing," Adelaide said. He thought about this. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not." She finished the mending and put the shirt aside and said, "Do you ever think about what you want that is not the ranch, not the tasks but the life?" He looked at the ridge for a long time. "Sometimes," he said. "I am not sure I know the difference well enough to answer that properly." She looked at him in the soft failing light, the scar on his jaw pale against the tan of his skin, the set of his shoulders that was not tension but readiness, that perpetual readiness of a man who had learned the world could require something of him at any moment. "I think you know more of the difference than you are letting yourself acknowledge," she said gently. He turned his head and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she did not have a name for yet, that complicated thing she had first seen across 40 feet of crowded street. He did not answer, but he held her gaze for a long time before he looked back at the ridge, and she thought that in the language they were slowly building, that was an answer of its own. The trouble with the double bar W arrived, as trouble generally does in September in Texas, without much warning and from two directions at once. The first direction was water. The summer had been dry, and the creek that fed the ranch's west pasture had dropped to a trickle, and 3 of Isaiah's best breeding cows had pushed through a weakened fence section to find better water on land that belonged to a man named Radford Dell, who owned the spread to the north, and who had been watching the double bar W with covetous attention for several years under the theory that if Isaiah ever had a bad enough season he might sell at a price Radford considered favorable. Radford Dell was not a violent man, but he was a relentlessly legalistic one, and he had his ranch manager ride down to inform Isaiah that the 3 cows were being held as compensation for damages to his grazing grass, which was a calculation he had done himself without reference to any standard that Isaiah found credible. Isaiah heard this news from his fence without visible agitation, asked the ranch manager to tell Radford Dell he would be by in the morning, and rode back to the house and explained the situation to Adelaide over supper with the careful neutrality he used for problems he was working through internally. "What does he want?" Adelaide asked. "He wants a reason to negotiate," Isaiah said. "He has wanted to buy the south quarter of my range for 3 years. He thinks 3 cows and a dry summer will give him the leverage." "And will it?" "It will not," Isaiah said, with a flatness that answered the question completely. Adelaide thought for a moment. "The creek that borders your south fence, does that water source originate on your property or his?" Isaiah looked at her with a slightly different expression than usual. "The spring is on my land," he said, "so the water that runs through his property in the wet season comes through yours first," she said. Yes. And if you chose to dig a diversion channel on your property, you could redirect that flow without leaving your land. A pause. Yes, he said more carefully. I am not suggesting you do it, she said. I am suggesting that Radford Dell probably knows you could do it, and that if you mention this when discussing the cows, he might find the cows considerably less interesting. Isaiah looked at her across the table for a long moment. Then he said, with the dry quality that was his equivalent of high spirits, "You would have made a very effective cattle baron." "I make a very effective teacher," she said, "which is a related skill set in some respects." He went to Radford Dell the next morning, and he came back that afternoon with 3 cows and without the south quarter, and he told her on the porch that evening that the conversation had been brief, and that the water had come up exactly as she had calculated, and she nodded and went back to the letter she was writing to the school board and felt quietly satisfied in the way she felt when a calculation proved accurate. "Adelaide," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Simply and directly, the way he said everything that mattered. "You are welcome, Isaiah," she said, in the same tone. The second direction that trouble came from was more personal and more complicated. A woman named Sylvia Crane arrived in Dusty Creek in the second week of September, traveling through on her way from San Antonio to Denver. And she was beautiful in the obvious and immediate way of someone who has always been beautiful and carries it like an expected fact of the landscape. She was also Isaiah's former intended, a fact that Adelaide learned from Thomas Reeves, who had heard it from Pete, who had heard it from the blacksmith in town, which was the standard method by which information traveled through Dusty Creek. Adelaide learned this on a Tuesday and spent Tuesday evening being more quiet than usual, which Isaiah noticed because he noticed everything about her, including the things she tried to keep off her face, though he had not yet told her this. "Something is on your mind," he said on the porch in the dark. "Several things," she said. "They will keep." "They do not have to keep," he said. She considered for a moment whether to be careful or direct, and chose direct because she always did. "I heard that Sylvia Crane is in Dusty Creek," she said. "And I heard about your history. I am not asking for details. I am telling you that I know, so that there is no situation in which you feel you are handling information that I do not have." He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than his usual quiet. This was the quiet of something sharp and carefully managed. "We were engaged for 8 months," he said. "In 1879. She found the scar difficult to live with. Not the fact of it, but what other people said about it." He said this without self-pity, in the same level tone he might use to describe weather. "She married a man in San Antonio who is apparently prosperous and agreeable. I do not have any particular feelings about her visit." Adelaide looked at him in the dark. "I am sorry," she said. "That was unkind of her." He shook his head slightly. "People find their own levels," he said. "She found hers." She thought about this for a moment, and then she said something that surprised them both by how much it cost her to say it, because she had not realized until she said it how much she meant it. "The scar does not trouble me," she said. "It has not troubled me from the beginning. I thought you should know that." The silence that followed this was very still, and she felt it like a change in the air. "I know," he said after a time. "I have known." He paused. "That is not a small thing, Adelaide." "I know it is not," she said quietly. He reached across the space between their chairs in the dark and put his hand over hers on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand and held his. And they sat like that in the warm Texas night, while the stars wheeled overhead and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and everything that was being communicated perfectly well. Sylvia Crane came to the Double Bar W on a Wednesday afternoon, which was bold, and which Adelaide had to give her a degree of credit for, because it took a particular kind of nerve to ride out to a man's ranch after things had ended the way they had. She arrived on a hired horse while Adelaide was in the kitchen garden, and she dismounted with the practiced grace of a woman who was accustomed to being watched, and paused at the garden gate when she saw Adelaide in the dirt rows. "Mrs. Warren," she said, with an uncertainty that was not entirely performed. "Miss Crane," Adelaide said, because Thomas had described her well enough that identification was not difficult. "Isaiah is in the south pasture. He will be back before supper if you would like to wait." Sylvia Crane was perhaps 26, with ash-blonde hair and the kind of regular features that people wrote poems about, and she was studying Adelaide with a frankness that Adelaide found she did not resent because it seemed to come from genuine rather than competitive curiosity. "I am not here to make trouble," Sylvia said. "I did not think you were," Adelaide said, and she meant it. Sylvia looked at the garden. "You have been working hard here," she said. "It needed work," Adelaide said simply. "Would you like to come inside? There is coffee." They sat at Adelaide's kitchen table, which had been Pete Calhoun's kitchen table until 3 weeks ago, and which she had claimed by the simple act of keeping it clean and putting wildflowers on it in a tin cup. And they drank coffee, and Sylvia Crane talked about San Antonio and her husband and the journey to Denver, and Adelaide talked about Missouri and the teaching certificate and the stagecoach. And they arrived, by the kind of angular route that honest women find together, at the real subject. "He is a good man," Sylvia said. It was an apology disguised as a statement. "Yes," Adelaide agreed, "he is." "I was not brave enough," Sylvia said, and she said it plainly, without asking for absolution, which Adelaide respected. "Different people want different things," Adelaide said, which was not a consolation but an observation, and Sylvia Crane took it as such. Isaiah came back an hour later and found them in the kitchen, and the expression on his face when he saw Sylvia was not pain or longing, but something closer to the careful composure of a man who has already made his peace with something, and is simply waiting to confirm that the peace has held. He greeted her courteously and sat and had coffee and talked about nothing in particular, and Sylvia left before supper and rode back to town, and that was the end of it. That night, Isaiah looked at Adelaide across the kitchen table and said, "How was the afternoon?" "Instructive," she said. "How so?" She considered the best way to say it. "I think I have been waiting," she said, "to find out what kind of life this is, what it actually is, not what it might be." She looked at him steadily. "I think I am finding out." He held her gaze with that look she still did not have a name for, and then he said quietly, "What is it?" She said, "It is a good life, Isaiah. I think it is a very good life." He looked at the table and then back at her, and what she saw on his face then she did not try to analyze or categorize. She simply let it be there, let it be real and present and warmly significant in the lamplight between them. He was not a man who moved quickly toward anything he valued. She had learned. He was careful with things that mattered, the way you are careful with something that could be damaged by careless handling. So she was not surprised that it was another 2 weeks before what changed between them on the porch. The night she told him, the scar did not trouble her became something more articulate. And she was not impatient about the waiting because she had come to understand that the waiting was itself part of his care, that he was making certain before he allowed something to become definite. It was a Saturday evening in October, and the air had finally broken from the killing heat of summer and come down to something cooler and clean, with a wind off the north that smelled like rain coming. Adelaide had been to Dusty Creek that afternoon with Pete driving the buckboard, and she had stopped at the school board office and been told that the position was hers if she wanted it, starting in November, 3 days a week while they found permanent funding, and she had said yes with a restrained enthusiasm that she had abandoned on the walk back to the buckboard in favor of something considerably more like joy. She told Isaiah at supper, and he listened to the whole account and then said, "You are happy about this?" "Extremely," she said. "Good," he said, and then he said something she had not heard him say before, in a tone she had not heard from him before, something softer and more deliberate. "You should be happy," he said. "You have been working toward it." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them as always. "I had a good deal of help with my equilibrium," she said, "from an unexpected source." He shook his head slightly, the gesture of a man denying credit he felt he had not earned, but she held his gaze until he stopped shaking his head. "You gave me a home," she said. You gave it to me without conditions. That matters. You made it a home, he said. There is a difference. Perhaps we both did, she said. He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight. Then he said, Adelaide. Isaiah, she said. I want to say something, he said, and I want to be certain I say it accurately because I do not want to say it wrong. She waited. I did not know why I bid that day, he said. On the platform, I have been thinking about it since, the way you asked me and I could not answer. He leaned forward slightly, both hands on the table, and she had the sense of a man arriving at something after a very long journey on foot. I think what it was is that you looked like someone who deserved to be chosen, not acquired, chosen. And I wanted to be the person who chose you, even before I knew anything about you, because something in the way you stood on that platform told me you were worth choosing. He stopped and then said, more quietly, and I was right. You are more than I knew how to anticipate. Adelaide Keller felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked, something that had been carefully fastened since the day she read the death notice on the Dusty Creek post and understood that she was alone in the world in a new and definitive way. She felt it come open with a warmth that spread through her whole chest, and she put her hands over his on the table and held them, and she said, Isaiah Warren, for a man who said he could not answer, you have just answered. He turned his hands under hers and held them properly, and he said, with the slight roughness of a man whose voice has been caught by something, I suppose I have finally figured out what I mean. She leaned across the table and kissed him, because she was not, had never been, the kind of woman who waited for the world to act when acting herself was available as an option. And the kiss was warm and certain and tasted like coffee and something sweeter. And when she sat back she was smiling, and he was smiling too, the real full smile she had not seen yet, and it was worth every mile of the stage from Missouri. The winter that followed was the kind of winter that stories are made of, though not the dramatic kind. It was the quietly extraordinary kind, the kind where a life becomes itself gradually and without announcement. Adelaide started teaching at the Dusty Creek schoolhouse on the 1st of November, riding in with Pete on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And the 14 students in her charge were a range of ages and abilities and levels of enthusiasm that she met with the organized ferocity that she brought to every difficult problem. She had the classroom running with genuine efficiency within 2 weeks, and by December she had 2 of her older students reading at levels they had not known they were capable of, and the school board, which had initially given her the position as a temporary measure while being somewhat condescending about its permanence, had quietly stopped discussing finding someone else. At the Double Bar W, the life between herself and Isaiah deepened in the winter months with the particular richness that comes from being genuinely indoors together, in the warmth of a stone house on a cold plain, with nowhere particular to be but with each other. She learned that he read, which she had suspected, and that his preferences ran to history and natural science, and she borrowed his books and they talked about them, which led to conversations that went on past midnight on the nights when the north wind was rattling the windows and the fire needed banking. She learned that he had a habit of coming in from the cold with his hat still on and forgetting to take it off until she reminded him. And she learned that he made the coffee too strong by any conventional standard, but that she had adapted to this, and now found conventional coffee thin. He learned that she hummed when she was working, and that the song was usually a hymn she had learned from her mother, but that she was not always aware she was doing it. He learned that she kept her counsel on most things for longer than people expected, and that when she finally spoke on a subject, she had usually thought about it from 12 different angles, and her conclusion was almost always correct. He learned to wait for her conclusions and take them seriously, which she noticed and appreciated without commenting on directly. By January of 1883, the Double Bar W was the kind of home that the original builder might have imagined and been satisfied to see. The kitchen garden was in its winter rest but clearly planned for spring. The curtains Adelaide had redyed were still a good blue. Pete Calhoun had developed a habit of inventing reasons to come to the main house for coffee at an hour of the day when Adelaide would typically be baking, a behavior that she found transparently motivated and entirely charming. Thomas Reeves had, at Isaiah's suggestion and Adelaide's tutoring, enrolled in her reading class at the schoolhouse, which he experienced as simultaneously humiliating and transformative, and which he talked about in the bunkhouse with such enthusiasm that the second cowhand, a quiet Texan named Mercer, had eventually asked if there was room in the class for one more adult student. There was. Adelaide made room. In February, Isaiah came in from the range one afternoon in a snow that was unusual for this part of Texas, and found Adelaide at the kitchen table with paper and ink, writing with the focused absorption she brought to correspondence, and he stood behind her for a moment and then said, "Are you writing to your stepbrother?" She looked up. "No," she said. "I am writing to the Missouri State Normal School to inquire about submitting an article for their quarterly bulletin. I have some thoughts about teaching reading to adult students that I believe they might find useful." He looked at the pages she had covered and said, "How many pages have you written?" "These are the notes," she said. "The article will be separate." She looked at him. "You are snow-covered. Go stand by the fire." He went and stood by the fire and pulled off his coat and hat, and she went back to her notes, and the kitchen was warm and lamplight gold in the February afternoon, and he looked at her bent over her papers with her hair coming down from its pins on one side, absorbed in her work, and he felt something that had been building in him for months arrive at a particular clarity. He said, "Adelaide." She said, still writing, "I love you." She stopped writing. She looked up at him standing by the fire, snow melting from his hat brim onto the hearthstones, the scar on his jaw turned toward her in the firelight. She saw on his face the steady certainty that had replaced the complicated, unknown look, the look of a man who has finally arrived at what he means and is certain of it. She set her pen down. "I know," she said softly. "I have known for a while." She stood up and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him in the firelight. "And I love you. I have known that for a while too." He put his hands on her face, very carefully, the way he handled things he valued, and she put her hands on his chest, and he kissed her with the same deliberate certainty he brought to everything he meant, and the fire was warm at their backs, and the February snow was clicking against the windows, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Spring came to the double bar W with a rush of green that Adelaide had not anticipated after the long dryness of her first Texas summer. The kitchen garden expanded from its original footprint, because she had acquired more seeds over the winter and had specific plans for tomatoes and peppers, and a border of marigolds that Pete Calhoun said was unnecessary, and that she planted anyway, correctly predicting that he would come to appreciate them. The creek that fed the west pasture was running full in April, and Isaiah said it was the best spring water he had seen in 4 years, and the cattle were fat and the calf crop was strong, and in the evenings he would take her riding on the open range in the long Texas light and show her the country he knew like his own hands, and she would ride beside him and listen while he named things and explained them. The geology of the limestone ridge and the migration patterns of the birds, and the way you could read a week's worth of weather in the quality of the morning light. And she stored all of this information the way she stored everything, carefully and for use. She was riding with him one April evening on the ridge above the ranch when she told him about the child. She had known for 3 weeks but had waited until she was certain, and she had chosen the moment with the care she brought to important communications, which meant she chose the ridge at sunset, which was the place he was most fully himself, where the complicated reserve he maintained in town fell away entirely, and he was simply the man he was, unhurried and grounded and genuinely at peace. "Isaiah," she said. "In September, I believe, perhaps October." He pulled his horse up and turned to look at her. She watched his face. The expression that moved across it was nothing like the complicated, unknown look of the auction platform, and nothing like the deliberate certainty of the February kitchen. It was simpler than either of those and larger than both, and she recognized it with a sudden fullness in her own chest because she had seen that expression once before, in the portrait of her parents that now hung on the wall of the main room of the Double Bar W, in her father's face on the day her mother had presumably told him something similar. Adelaide, he said, just her name, but the way he said it. She smiled at him, and he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they sat on the ridge in the golden April evening while the Double Bar W spread below them in the long light and the limestone turned its afternoon orange and the sky above them was enormous and full of possibility. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "No," she said. "Are you?" He thought about this seriously, which was his nature. "A little," he said, "in the best possible way." She squeezed his hand. "That is exactly the right answer," she said. The summer of 1883 was busy in the particular way that a ranch that has found its proper rhythm is always busy, full of work that means something and ends each day in legitimate tiredness rather than the hollow kind. Adelaide taught through June and took July and August as her school board had negotiated, and she used the extra time to be systematically formidable about the ranch accounts, which she had begun keeping in February, and which she had improved in clarity and accuracy by enough that Isaiah had gone from reviewing them weekly to reviewing them monthly because the monthly review was sufficient, and the weekly one was starting to feel like doubt she had not earned. She also, in the summer months, began to know the neighbors properly, which was a project she had set herself as a matter of both practical sense and personal satisfaction. The Reeves family, Thomas's parents, ran a homestead 4 miles south and were warm and hardworking people who came to the Double Bar W for the occasional Sunday meal. A Mexican family named Garza had a small spread to the east, running sheep on land that some of the other ranchers looked at with the particular narrow disapproval that Adelaide found she had very little patience for, and she made a point of visiting with Alina Garza when she was in town, which seemed to surprise Alina, and then, after a few conversations, seemed to please her. And the two women developed a friendship based on mutual practicality and a shared ability to find the absurdity in the various social conventions of the frontier that decided what kinds of people were allowed to be neighborly. Radford Dell remained to the north, but his interest in the Double Bar W's south quarter had cooled since the spring conversation, and he was civilly distant when he and Isaiah encountered each other in town, which suited both parties adequately. On the 1st of September, 1883, Adelaide gave birth to a son in the bedroom with the east-facing window, attended by the doctor from Dusty Creek and by Pete Calhoun's wife, a competent and unflappable woman named Grace, who had come down from her place in Abilene to help when Pete had written her with the situation. It was a 14-hour labor, and Adelaide was characteristically determined throughout it, and at the end of it she was exhausted in a way she had not previously understood exhaustion could feel, and she was holding a boy who was red-faced and vigorous, and who had his father's dark hair, and what she was almost certain would eventually be her gray eyes. Isaiah was allowed in after, and he came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Adelaide with an expression that was so uncomplicated in its fullness that she felt tears on her own face, which surprised her because she was not generally a woman who cried. "He is remarkable," Isaiah said. "He is," she agreed. "I think he looks like you." Isaiah looked at the baby again. "I hope not," he said very quietly, and she knew he meant the scar, and she sat up a little despite the exhaustion and said, with a firmness that she needed him to hear, "Isaiah Warren, your face is a fine face, and I will not have you teaching your son anything different. Is that understood?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, something that had been in place for a very long time moving aside for something cleaner. "Yes," he said. "Understood." She lay back. "We need a name," she said. They had discussed names through the summer without settling, because they both had opinions and neither would concede until the right answer presented itself. She looked at the baby in the early September morning light coming through the east window, the limestone ridge visible beyond it, and she said, "Jacob Henry Warren, for my father and yours." Isaiah looked at his son. "Jacob Henry," he said, trying it. The baby opened his eyes, dark and unfocused in the way of new babies, and looked at no particular thing with the profound seriousness of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is taking stock. "He agrees," Adelaide said. Isaiah laughed. It was a full and genuine laugh. The laugh of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know how to find when he started looking, and it was the best sound she had heard in a long time. Pete Calhoun celebrated Jacob Henry's arrival by appearing on the porch the next morning with a carved wooden horse that he had evidently been working on in secret for some weeks, a thing of genuine craftsmanship and obvious love. Thomas Reeves brought a blanket knitted by his mother, who had sent it with Thomas's shy note that it was the least they could do. Elena Garza rode over from the east spread with tamales, and a hand-embroidered cloth for the cradle that was so beautiful that Adelaide kept it folded in her drawer, rather than risk the baby's enthusiasm for chewing on things spoiling it, though she told Elena it was in daily use. Even Reverend Hollies made the ride out, to bless the child and to drink coffee, and to inform Adelaide that he thought the school board was foolish for not making her position permanent, which was the most she had liked him since the wedding. Jacob Henry Warren grew with the systematic enthusiasm of a child who has decided that existing is an excellent project and intends to approach it vigorously. By winter he was alert and demanding and interested in everything, and Adelaide, who had thought she understood something about love already, found that she had been working with an incomplete version of the concept, and that the complete version was considerably more expansive and occasionally exhausting than the partial one. Isaiah was with the baby in the way she had hoped he would be, and had not been entirely certain he would know how to be, given his own history of being raised in a house from which the softness had departed early. He was careful and present and serious about it, which she should have predicted because he was careful and present and serious about everything he valued, and he held Jacob Henry in the evenings by the fire with the particular gravity of a man who is holding something precious and knows it, and does not need to perform knowing it for anyone else's benefit. She watched them sometimes from across the room, the man and the baby in the firelight, the scar on Isaiah's jaw catching the light, and she thought about that platform in August of 1882, and the gavel coming down, and the way she had walked toward him through the parting crowd because there was nothing else to do, and she thought about how the most significant things in a life often arrive sideways, not from the direction you were watching, not through the door you left open for them. She had come west broken and practical and determined to make the best of whatever she found. She had not expected to find this. She had not known this was a possible destination when she bought the stage ticket in Missouri with 3 of her last $4. She would have come anyway, she thought. She would have come because she had no better option, and because she was not a woman who stood still and waited for the ground to stop dropping. But she was profoundly and completely glad that she had. In the spring of 1884, the Dusty Creek School Board made Adelaide's position permanent, with a full week of instruction and a modest but genuine salary, and the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was feeding Jacob Henry his breakfast and Isaiah was reading the week-old newspaper from San Antonio that arrived in batches with the mail rider. She read the letter twice and set it on the table between them, and he picked it up and read it and said, "I expected this." The board would have been foolish not to. "You have said that before," she said. "It was true before," he said. "It remains true." He set the letter down and looked at her across the table over the top of Jacob Henry's dark head. "Are you pleased?" "Very," she said. "Good," he said. And then in the tone that meant he had been thinking about something and had reached a conclusion, "I want to build a schoolroom onto the house." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. A room off the east side of the main building," he said. "Enough for a teaching space. You could take students here on the days you are not in town." Children from the more distant homesteads who cannot make the ride to Dusty Creek regularly. She looked at him. Jacob Henry chose this moment to smear a considerable quantity of mashed beans across his father's newspaper, which Isaiah regarded with the stoic acceptance he brought to all of Jacob Henry's more expressive moments. "That would be a significant undertaking," she said. "I know how to build," he said. "So does Pete. Thomas has been useful in the past when there was hammering to be done." "It would also be generous," she said, "more generous than is strictly required." He looked at her with the expression she now knew very well, the one that had started on the platform and clarified over 2 years into something she could read perfectly. "You are more than strictly required," he said. "This is more than a transaction. It has been from the beginning, even when I did not know what I meant." She felt the warmth she associated with him spread through her chest in the way it had not diminished with familiarity, but had, if anything, deepened with it. "Build the room, Isaiah," she said. He built the room through May, with Pete and Thomas, and on weekends, the Garza brothers from the East Spread, who turned out to be excellent carpenters and who Isabella, Alina's youngest daughter, described as being much better at following Adelaide's instructions than their father was at following their mother's, which Adelaide took as a straightforward compliment. The room was finished by early June, 14 feet by 16, with 3 windows for light and a proper board floor and a small iron stove for the winter months. And Adelaide spent a Saturday afternoon arranging it with the focused intensity of a woman who knows exactly what a learning space needs to feel like. And when she was done, it looked like a schoolroom and smelled like new wood and possibility. The first students came in September. 5 children from the homesteads within a 4-mile radius of the Double Bar W, who could not reliably make the Dusty Creek ride on school days. Their parents came to the door with them the first morning with the mixed expressions of people who want something very much for their children, but are not entirely certain they have the right to ask for it. And Adelaide stood in the doorway and said hello to each child by name, because she had made it her business to know them already. And she showed them into the new room, and the morning of teaching that followed was one of the most satisfied mornings she could remember. Jacob Henry, by now a walking and strongly opinionated 13 months old, had been established in the main room with Pete Calhoun as his supervisor during school mornings, an arrangement that Pete treated with the grave responsibility of a man given an important commission, and that Jacob Henry treated as an opportunity to conduct experiments in cause and effect involving Pete's hat and anything within reach. Isaiah came in at noon to collect his son from Pete, and found them both on the kitchen floor examining a collection of interesting rocks that Jacob Henry had assembled with Pete's assistance. And he stood in the doorway and looked at the scene, and then looked into the schoolroom where Adelaide was still finishing the morning lesson with the 2 older students. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he had paid $30 for the most extraordinary person he had ever known, and that this remained, by any reasonable calculation, the most accurate price he had ever been wrong about. It was worth everything he had and more than he had known he wanted. That evening, after Jacob Henry was asleep in his crib in the corner of the main room that had been arranged for him, and after supper was cleared and the dishes done and the lamplight was turned low, Adelaide and Isaiah sat on the porch in the cooling September evening, which was becoming familiar after 2 years as the place where the most real conversations happened, and she leaned against his shoulder because she could, and because she wanted to, and because this was, she had decided some months ago, one of the finest uncomplicated pleasures available in a life. He put his arm around her. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You have that particular look," she smiled. "I have been thinking about what you said on the auction platform, that you were not entirely certain." "I remember," he said. "I think I understand it better now than I did then," she said. "I think you knew before you knew you knew. I think some part of you understood what you were moving toward before your mind had caught up to it." He was quiet for a moment. The night was full of cricket sound and the distant lowing of cattle and the particular quality of a Texas September night, which is cooler than August by just enough to make you grateful. "Yes," he said, "I think that is accurate. It has been accurate from the beginning," she said. "That is what I find remarkable." He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. "What do you mean?" "You bid before you knew why," she said. "You were honest when I asked you and you could not answer. You gave me the room and the time and you did not ask for more than I could give yet. You built the schoolroom." She paused. "Everything you have done from that first moment has been the right thing, Isaiah, even when you did not know what you meant." He was very still for a moment. She felt it in his shoulder under her cheek. "I cannot claim credit for the wisdom in it," he said finally. "Most of it was instinct." "Good instincts are a kind of wisdom," she said. "I am a teacher, trust me." He made the sound that was his laugh when he was being quiet about it. She felt it in his chest. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes. I am glad I bid." She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds and the warmth of him beside her and said, with the simple certainty of something that has been true for long enough that it no longer needs elaboration, "So am I, Isaiah. So am I." 2 more years passed in the way of years that are genuinely being lived, marked not by their drama but by their accumulation of meaning. The kitchen garden at the Double Bar W became something of a subject of comment in Dusty Creek, because Adelaide had a particular talent for growing things that came from the same part of her that had a talent for teaching, which was the part that understood systems and attention, and the patient observation of what something needed in order to become what it was capable of being. She had tomatoes that she traded with Elena Garza for peppers, and occasionally for Elena's remarkable tamales. And she had beans she dried for winter and squash she stored in the root cellar, and enough herbs that the kitchen always smelled of something living and green. Jacob Henry grew into himself in the way of a boy with 2 capable and attentive parents, which is to say stubbornly and enthusiastically, and with a determination that Adelaide recognized as coming from both of them, and a volatility that she was privately certain came primarily from herself, though she never said so. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a nature that was simultaneously gregarious and focused, so that he could spend 2 hours talking energetically at Pete Calhoun about horses, and then fall completely silent for another 2 hours, while he worked out some private problem of construction with sticks and stones in the dirt of the yard. Isaiah watched his son with the careful attention he brought to all things he loved, and sometimes in the evenings when Jacob Henry was asleep, and the house was quiet, he would say to Adelaide something that she recognized as the continuing work of a man who was reconciling who he had been with who he was becoming, small and important observations that she received with the seriousness they deserved. One night in January of 1886, with Jacob Henry 2 and a half and sleeping in his own small room and the north wind coming down hard from the Panhandle direction, Isaiah said, "I think he is going to be remarkable." "He is already remarkable," Adelaide said, mending by the fire. "I mean when he is older," Isaiah said. "I can see it in the way he works through things. He does not give up." "He absolutely does not give up," Adelaide agreed with the rueful tone of a woman who had spent an afternoon that week in a negotiation with a 2-year-old about the importance of boots in cold weather. "He gets that from his father." Isaiah looked at her with a slight expression. "I was told it comes from his mother." "We disagree," she said primly. He smiled. The full smile, which was no longer rare, which she had been given freely for almost 3 years now, and which she still valued every time in the specific way you value something that was once rare and is now given generously. In the spring of 1886 she told him about the second child, standing in the kitchen garden in the April morning, and this time he was not across a ridge but standing next to her, and he heard her and he reached for her hand in the dirt rose and held it, and he said quietly, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Good," he said. "And then with the dry quality, we will need to expand the root cellar." She laughed. She laughed properly, in the full warm morning, and he laughed with her. and the kitchen garden was coming up in the April rose, and the limestone ridge was orange in the morning light, and the double bar W was more itself than it had ever been. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1886, and she was Adelaide from the first moment in the way that Jacob Henry had been Isaiah, which was to say that she had opinions, and she expressed them with vigor, and she did not take no for an answer in any situation she had decided should have a different outcome. They named her Clara Ruth, for Isaiah's grandmother on his father's side, which Isaiah had suggested, and Adelaide had accepted immediately, because she had known from the day she arrived that the house needed a woman's name in its history, and this was the right way to put one there. Pete Calhoun, who was 65 now and moving slower in the cold mornings, but who had absolutely no intention of being anywhere other than the double bar W for whatever years were left to him, held Clara Ruth with the experienced care of someone who had by this point helped raise Jacob Henry through the first years and knew what he was doing, and he told her solemnly that she was a fine girl and that the ranch was going to have to get used to her, which turned out to be prophetic. The school room off the east side of the house had by 1887 become a permanent fixture of the community, in a way that no one had quite planned, but that everyone seemed to have accepted as the natural order of things. Adelaide taught 6 mornings a week now, splitting her time between the double bar W schoolroom and the Dusty Creek School, and the school board had stopped any pretense of considering other arrangements, because the results were visible, and the community had made its preferences clear. She had a system of older students helping younger ones that she had worked out over 2 years of practice, and that she wrote about in an article that was eventually published in the Missouri State Normal School Quarterly Bulletin in 1887, which arrived in the mail on a Thursday and which she held in her hands in the kitchen for a long moment before showing Isaiah, who read it standing at the counter and then looked at her and said, "Well done, Adelaide." She had found over the years that his specific and genuine praise meant more to her than any elaborate compliment from anyone else could, because it came from a man who did not use words without meaning them. "Thank you," she said. "I could not have written it without the double bar W schoolroom, which means I could not have written it without you." "You would have found a way," he said. "Probably," she admitted, "but it would have taken longer and been less comfortable." He set the bulletin down and came and stood next to her at the kitchen window, looking out at the April morning, and she leaned against him because this was still and always one of the finest things, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a while in the kitchen with the coffee ready on the stove, and the children's voices coming faintly from somewhere in the yard. "I have been thinking about the South Quarter," he said. "What about it?" she said. "There is a parcel adjacent to it on the other side of the creek," he said. "Ben Halcott wants to sell. He is going back east to be near his daughter." He paused. "It would double our water access in dry years. I think we could carry more cattle without the strain we had in 1882. She thought about this. "Can we afford it? If this year's drive goes as projected, yes," he said. "Then buy it," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. "You are certain?" "I have been keeping the accounts for 4 years," she said. "I am certain." She looked up at him. "Isaiah, this is your place. It has always been yours. I want it to be large enough for what you want it to be." He looked at her for a moment with the look she knew best, the one that had started on the auction platform in 1882 and had been becoming itself ever since, the complicated unknown thing that had resolved itself year by year into something completely legible, something that was as clear and permanent as limestone. "Ours," he said. "What?" "It is ours," he said. "It has been ours for a long time. I would appreciate it if you stopped calling it mine." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, ours." He bought the Halcott parcel in July, and the double bar W expanded along the creek and into the good grass on the other side. And the cattle drive that fall was the best they had done, enough to clear the land purchase and build a proper summer kitchen off the back of the house that Adelaide had been wanting since her second winter. Thomas Reeves, who was 25 now and had been with Isaiah since he was a raw teenager, took over management of the new section with the quiet competence of a man who had been well taught and who had risen to what he had been taught to do. Jacob Henry, at 4 years old, decided that Thomas was the most important person on the ranch and pursued him with an intensity that Thomas bore with good-humored patience and occasional collaboration, allowing Jacob Henry to ride with him on a gentle horse named Biscuit while conducting the morning rounds of the expanded property, a ritual that Jacob Henry described as working, which Isaiah heard with a complicated expression that Adelaide recognized as the contained form of profound happiness. Clara Ruth, at 1 year old, had strong views about everything, and expressed them in a volume that suggested she was not going to wait for anyone to invite her participation in the world. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's particular quality of focused determination and Pete Calhoun's complete devotion, and she was, Adelaide thought privately, very possibly going to run something significant when she grew up, though she kept this opinion to herself on the grounds that it was too early to burden a 1-year-old with expectations. The fall of 1887 was the last time Adelaide allowed herself to think about what the life might have been if any of the 1,000 things that had to go right for this specific life to exist had gone differently. She was sitting on the porch on an October evening, the air cool and clear, with Jacob Henry asleep inside and Clara Ruth asleep and Isaiah beside her in his chair with his coffee, and the stars over the Texas plain were doing what they always did, filling the enormous sky with the particular extravagance that had nothing to do with human concerns and everything to do with making you aware of your own small, precise location in the middle of something immeasurable. She thought about the stagecoach from Missouri and the $4.11 and the platform in the August heat and the gavel coming down 3 times. She thought about the woman she had been then, who was practical and determined and not easily broken, but who was genuinely alone in a way she had not known how to name at the time. She thought about Isaiah at the back of the crowd with his thumbs in his belt and the scar pale in the August light, bidding $30 for a stranger because something in him knew before he knew. She thought about how he could not answer when she asked him why. She thought about all the ways the answer had been given over the years in every careful and deliberate and quiet and warm thing he had ever done, so that by now the answer was not a sentence but a life, a full and ongoing and genuinely extraordinary life that was more than she had known to want when she bought the stage ticket. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about the auction." He waited. "I have been thinking about how you could not answer," she said. "And about how, if you had been able to answer, if you had known immediately and completely why you bid, you might have said something that was not quite right. Something that was true at the moment but not the full truth of what it would become." He was quiet for a time, watching the stars. "Yes," he said finally, "I think that is right." "I am glad you could not answer then," she said. "I think the real answer needed time to become itself." He reached across and took her hand the way he had on the ridge in April of 1883, and she held it, and he said in the voice that was low and steady and entirely his, "The real answer is this, all of this. Everything that has happened since." She held his hand and watched the enormous Texas sky and listened to the night sounds of the double-bar W, which she knew by now as well as she had ever known anything, the particular creak of the porch board under the west chair, the sound the gate made when the wind was from the north, the night calls of the birds along the creek, the way the limestone ridge was different in moonlight than in daylight, different from every angle and always the same ridge. "Yes," she said. "The real answer is all of this." They sat in the October evening in the particular peace of people who have found what they were looking for and know it, and the stars moved in their slow, ancient arcs over the double-bar W. And inside the house, Jacob Henry and Clara Ruth slept in their rooms, and Pete Calhoun was in the bunkhouse, very probably playing cards with Thomas and Mercer, and losing contentedly. And the horses were in the barn, and the cattle were on the range, and the kitchen garden was in its fall rest, and the schoolroom off the east side of the house still smelled faintly of chalk and new wood, and the particular good smell of children being taught things. Isaiah Warren had paid $30 in the summer of 1882 for a bride that nobody else had bid high enough to claim, and Adelaide Keller had asked him why, and he could not answer, and the answer had been 5 years in the building, which was, they had both concluded, exactly the right amount of time. It was the finest answer either of them had ever received. And the double-bar W in the October of 1887 was living proof of what happens when you act before you fully understand why, and when the person standing across from you on a hot August platform turns out to be exactly who you needed without either of you knowing it yet, and when you are patient enough and honest enough and present enough to let the answer become what it was always going to be. The answer was love. It was that simple, and that enormous, and that permanent. It was, like all the best things, both expected and more than you had known how to expect, and it was theirs.